Hey guys, today on JD Cars, we're going to be replacing the trailing arm ball joint bushing and outer arm bushing on the BMW E90. So what prompted this replacement was some squeaking coming from this rear ball joint here. It was really obnoxious and pretty embarrassing to drive around. So I actually pierced the rubber collar and applied some white lithium grease to the ball joint. That was able to resolve the problem. That's obviously only a very temporary solution as water and debris is going to get in there. So today we'll be replacing that. And as always, before we get started, I'd like to thank Bavarian Autosport for sending me the bushings and the necessary bushing tool set to get this job done. This tool set's complete with everything you need to pull old bushings out and to press new bushings into place on BMW E80s and E90s. So if you're looking to do a bushing replacement or any other maintenance to your BMW, be sure to check out bavauto.com. So first things first here, to gain better access, we're going to remove the rear wheel. So first things first, we'll need to remove this outer control arm fastener. The bolt here and the nut on the other side are both a 21mm. Before trying to remove this, it's a good idea to apply some pressure using a floor jack. Next, using a Sharpie, you're going to want to mark the nut and the eccentric washer like so you know where to tighten your nut back down to. Now we'll use a 21mm socket on our breaker bar to loosen the nut on this side and an 18mm box wrench to hold the bolt on the other side. Now we'll need to remove the 17mm nut on the bottom of your shock. Probably should have had the jack there. Whoops. Now we'll need to remove this 18mm bolt right here and an 18mm nut on the other side. Now the last thing we need to do here before we have access to this bushing is to move this arm out of the way. Now rather than loosening up the bolts, which are often seized and then having to retighten them in the proper location, I like to use a socket extension joint to hold the arm down out of the way, and that gives us plenty of room to work on the bushing. So just to show you what parts of the tool set we'll be using for this bushing, we're using number 1. As you can see, the bushing slides into number 1, and number 2 fits nicely to pull the bushing out. And then of course we'll be using the threaded rod number 9 and the nut number 8. So we'll be taking the threaded rod, pushing it through the bushing, then take part number 2 and thread the rod into part number 2, pull it tight against the bushing, slide part number 1 over the threaded rod, and then install your nut. I believe this is a 21mm nut here, but I don't have a 21mm box wrench or box wrench ratchet, so I'm just going to be using an adjustable wrench, and we're just going to tighten down on this nut, which will pull the bushing out. You've pulled the bushing out, so you can pull the entire assembly out like so. Now you can unscrew part number 2, revealing your bushing, which we can then pull out of part number 1. Now before we install our new bushing here, I'm going to bring it next to our old bushing, and you can see by the corrosion where the old bushing was located. So you want to line them up right next to each other. Transfer over the insertion depth from the old bushing onto the new one. Just make a little mark. This way we know how far to insert our new bushing. Okay, for installing the new bushing, I'll be using number 2 and number 4 along with the threaded rod and the nut. Now before we install the new bushing, I'm going to spray a little bit of PB Blaster, and I'm just going to use an old rag to clean out any of the debris in here. Now we can take our new bushing, get it into position here, take the threaded rod, come in from the other side, take tool number 2, put it on this side, thread the rod into tool number 2. Tool number 4 will go on the other side, along with the nut. So before I tighten this down, I'll just give you a little look at the setup. As you can see, we have the threaded rod through the entire part. We have tool number 4 sitting against this here, and then tool number 2, which is just a little bit skinnier than the bushing, and we'll be able to pull the bushing through. And we'll want to remember to keep an eye on this mark that we made here so we retain the same insertion depth. Now to remove the trailing arm bushing, we're going to need part number 3, 1, and the threaded rod and nut. We'll be repeating the same removal process as before on this bushing here. So we'll again need to transfer over our insertion depth from the old bushing. And the installation process of the trailing arm bushing is slightly different. We're going to need to use this clamp, slide the bushing into the clamp and position it about halfway through the clamp like so. Tighten it down, and once you've closed the gap between those pieces of the bushing, you can stop tightening it down. Now for the installation, we'll be using part number 1 and part number 7. Now just to give you a rundown of this process, we're gonna get this positioned into where it needs to go. Slide on part number 7 onto the back. And the only reason we're able to slide this on right now, and it's gonna be a tight fit, is because we have it clamped down. We're gonna slide our threaded rod through, get it threaded into part number 7, begin to pull the bushing through, and once the clamp begins to get pinched, we need to loosen up our nut a little bit, loosen up the clamp, remove it without removing part number 7, because part number 7 will still be holding the bushing shut. Then we can pull the bushing in the remaining distance. So your brake rotor shield is going to be in the way, which is why part number 7 has this notch. So we'll get our bushing somewhat into place here. Part number 7 with the notch. Come in from the back and slide it over the bushing. Then take your threaded rod, slide part number 1 over it, and slide it through the bushing and into part number 7. Now we can tighten down the nut. Once you've gotten the bushing in there, you can remove the clamp. You have to loosen it up quite a bit to get it around part number 7. And now with part number 7 still on there, we can continue to pull the bushing through. So once you can see your Sharpie mark line up there for the insertion depth, you can then loosen up the nut here. And we can remove the threaded rod, and you can remove part number 7. Now our new trailing arm bushing is installed, and we just have to reinstall the arm. So we'll pull out the socket extension holding the arm down, and we'll reinstall the 18mm nut and bolt. Now we can use our floor jack here to support our control arm. So with your control arm up into place, we can reinstall our 21mm bolt and the 21mm nut. Also need to reinstall the 17mm shock nut. Now we can lower our floor jack. And last but not least, using our 21mm socket and an 18mm box wrench, we need to tighten this back down according to our Sharpie mark. Alright guys, that concludes this video on how to replace your rear control arm bushings. Having the wheels off and the car up on the jack stands prompted me to adjust my coilovers. So I'm going to get those dialed in, ride on them for another week, and hopefully by next Friday I'll have the coilover review video up on the channel. So again, I'd like to pay a huge thank you to Bavarian Autosport for sending me the necessary tools and parts to do this job. Be sure to check them out at bavauto.com. Also, take a look at these gloves. They're extremely comfortable, very soft on the inside. They have padding for wrenching and whatnot, and they're great gloves. So that's it for today on JD Cars. Please leave a like below and subscribe if you've yet to do so. And I'll see you next time on JD Cars.